Imagine discovering that the story you thought you knew, the sacred narrative that has been told to billions over centuries, is not the full truth. Imagine learning that there are ancient writings, gospels hidden, silenced, and even condemned by the church, that reveal a very different portrait of Jesus than the one enshrined in doctrine. What would it mean if the figure at the heart of Western spirituality was far more complex, far more revolutionary than we have ever been allowed to believe? Today, we are going to journey into the mystery of one of the most controversial texts in history, a gospel that was banned, suppressed and labeled heretical, yet continues to whisper through the ruins of forgotten monasteries and desert caves. A gospel that portrays Jesus not as a distant divine figure locked away in ritual, but as a living teacher of hidden wisdom, speaking directly to the soul, offering not dogma, but liberation. This video will take you into a realm where faith meets secrecy, where official narratives clash with forbidden knowledge. And let me promise you something, what we uncover here has the power to transform not just your understanding of Christianity, but your vision of truth itself. Stay until the very end, because the last revelation I will share with you is the most important of all. It will open a door that cannot be closed once you step through it. Before we begin, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, leave a like, share this video, and comment your reflections below. This exploration will not just reveal facts, it will spark questions within you, questions that challenge the foundations of what you thought you knew. And perhaps together we will discover truths long hidden in plain sight. To begin, we must go back almost 2,000 years. After the death of Jesus, countless writings emerged, some attributed to his disciples, others to followers of the early Christian movement who preserved teachings in secret circles. The four Gospels we know today, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were eventually canonized by the Church, but they were not the only voices speaking of Jesus. Dozens of other accounts circulated, each offering unique interpretations of his message. Among these suppressed texts lies the so-called Gospel of Thomas. Unlike the familiar Gospels, it does not narrate the life of Jesus, his birth, miracles, crucifixion, or resurrection. Instead, it presents a collection of sayings, mystical, cryptic, and deeply esoteric. In it, Jesus speaks as a teacher of inner awakening, urging his followers to seek the kingdom not in the sky, nor in some distant future, but within themselves. Whoever drinks from my mouth, he says, will become as I am. I myself shall become that person, and the hidden things will be revealed to them. This is not the Jesus of rigid dogma. This is a Jesus pointing inward, telling humanity that divine truth is not mediated through priests or rituals, but discovered in the depths of one's own being. Why then would such a gospel be banned? Why would the Church, for centuries, label it dangerous and suppress its circulation? The answer lies in power. The institutional Church, as it grew in influence during the early centuries, sought to establish unity through authority. Only certain texts could be allowed, texts that reinforced hierarchy, obedience, and the need for mediation between God and man. A gospel that taught that the divine spark lives within each individual posed a radical threat to that system. It shifted the power away from the Church and placed it directly into the hands of the seeker. Think about it. If Jesus' message was truly about inner knowledge, about each person awakening to their own divine essence, then the elaborate structures of control, bishops, councils, rituals, intermediaries, become unnecessary. Would that not completely change how we view spirituality? Would it not mean that the sacred is closer to you than you ever imagined, perhaps as near as your own heartbeat? The Gospel of Thomas was discovered in 1945 among a collection of manuscripts buried in Nag Hammadi, Egypt. For centuries, it had been lost to history, surviving only in brief mentions by early church fathers who condemned it as heresy. But its rediscovery shook the world of biblical scholarship. Suddenly, we had in our hands an ancient text that challenged everything we thought we knew about the origins of Christianity. And here is where it becomes truly fascinating. Many scholars, such as Elaine Pagels and Helmut Koester, have argued that the sayings in this gospel may be as old, or even older, than the canonical gospels. If that is true, then we are not dealing with a late distortion, but with a window into the earliest and purest layers of Jesus' teaching. Could it be that the Church silenced one of the most authentic voices of the historical Jesus? Ask yourself, What does it mean that this text was buried, hidden away in jars under desert sand, only to resurface in the 20th century, a time when humanity was beginning to question tradition, authority, and the very structures of belief? Was its reappearance a coincidence, or could it be seen as a calling, a whisper from the past, reminding us of a truth long forgotten? And what about you? If you were to hear Jesus not as a distant figure wrapped in mystery, but as a teacher, inviting you to discover the kingdom within, how would that change your faith, your spirituality, your life? In the next part of our journey, we will go deeper into the heart of this forbidden gospel, uncovering its most mysterious sayings and exploring how they clash and sometimes align with the teachings preserved in the Bible we know today. And I promise you, the deeper we go, the more startling the revelations become. To truly grasp the magnitude of what the Gospel of Thomas represents, we must immerse ourselves in its words and allow them to echo in our minds. Unlike the canonical Gospels that narrate events, this text reads like a spiritual manual, brief, striking sayings designed to awaken rather than to instruct. It almost feels less like a story and more like a map to consciousness itself. One of its most famous passages reads, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not have that within you, what you do not have within you will kill you." These words strike at the very heart of human existence. They suggest that salvation is not something granted from outside, but rather discovered within. They place the responsibility not on priests or institutions, but on the individual seeker. Now compare this to the language of the New Testament canon. The canonical Gospels often emphasize faith in Christ as mediated through the Church, the sacraments, and adherence to a revealed authority. The Gospel of Thomas bypasses all of that. It speaks directly to the seeker. Awaken, look within, realize who you truly are. This divergence is precisely why the early church labeled it dangerous. A Jesus who tells you to trust your own inner light is far harder to control than a Jesus who speaks only through sanctioned interpreters. Think about this carefully. If salvation comes from within, if the divine spark is already planted in the soil of your own being, then the external structures of power lose their grip. You no longer depend entirely on sermons, on rituals, or on the gatekeeping of sacred spaces. Instead, every moment of your life, every breath you take becomes an opening to the kingdom. Could it be that this was Jesus' original intention, a radical empowerment of the human spirit? Modern scholars like Elaine Pagels in her groundbreaking book, The Gnostic Gospels, argue that texts such as Thomas reflect a form of Christianity that was suppressed by orthodoxy. This so-called Gnostic perspective saw knowledge, gnosis, not as intellectual information, but as transformative awareness. Salvation was not about believing the right doctrine, but about waking up to the divine essence already present within. This idea resonates with mystical traditions across cultures. The Upanishads in India speak of the Atman, the inner self that is one with Brahman, the ultimate reality. Sufi poets like Rumi describe the divine as a light hidden in the heart. Even within the Jewish mysticism of Jesus' own heritage, there are echoes of the same truth, that God is not confined to temples of stone, but is encountered in the depths of the soul. Could it be that Jesus too was pointing toward this universal mystery, and that the Gospel of Thomas preserves this radical essence? But here is where the controversy deepens. Some critics argue that the Gospel of Thomas reflects not the historical Jesus, but later, mystical reinterpretations. They say it belongs to fringe groups who distorted his teachings, yet others counter that the simplicity of its sayings, the absence of narrative embellishment, and its parallels with known traditions of wisdom suggest that it may in fact be closer to the voice of the original teacher than we imagine. Ask yourself, which seems more authentic? A simple, piercing statement like, "The kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth and men do not see it," or elaborate theological debates about Christ's nature that developed centuries later in church councils? Which feels more like the living breath of a prophet walking among his people, and which feels like the machinery of an institution codifying belief? And if the former is true, then what does that mean for us today? It means that the lost gospel challenges us not to wait for heaven, but to recognize it here and now. It calls us to awaken to the sacred presence hidden in everyday life. It tells us that the kingdom is not a reward for the dead, but a reality for the living. Pause for a moment and reflect. If heaven is here and now, what does that make of your own struggles, your own joys, your relationships, your work, even the silence in your mind? Could it be that all of it is already infused with the divine, if only we open our eyes to see? No wonder the church feared this message. If people believed that they carried the kingdom within them, they would no longer be as dependent on institutional authority. They would no longer require the intercession of priests to approach the divine. They would no longer fear threats of exclusion or damnation from ecclesiastical structures. They would be free, and freedom is the most dangerous power of all. This is why the early bishops fought so fiercely against the spread of Gnostic texts. Irenaeus of Lyons, writing in the 2nd century, condemned them as heresies, dangerous deviations that could lead souls astray. But what if, in their zeal to protect power, they suppressed not heresy but truth? What if the very gospel they buried was the one that could set humanity free from fear and awaken us to our own divine nature? The rediscovery of the Gospel of Thomas in 1945 was more than an archaeological event. It was like a message in a bottle from the past, surfacing at a moment when the modern world was questioning old authorities and searching for new forms of meaning. Perhaps it was not accidental that these words came back to light in an age when humanity was awakening to new spiritual horizons. And yet, the full implications of this gospel are still unfolding. Scholars debate, theologians argue, seekers reflect, but the words themselves remain, vibrating with an energy that is difficult to ignore. They do not demand belief, they demand awakening. In the next part of our journey, we will dive even deeper into the hidden wisdom of these sayings. We will explore the passages that reveal a vision of Jesus radically different from the one we think we know, sayings that speak of light, unity, and self-realization. And I promise you this, the further we go, the more we will see why this gospel was so feared and why its final message may be the most revolutionary of all. As we journey further into the mysteries of the Gospel of Thomas, the veil begins to lift on an image of Jesus that feels both familiar and startlingly new. This is not the Jesus clothed in centuries of doctrine, nor the Christ of rigid dogmas. This is a Jesus who speaks as a mystic, a guide of the inner path, a revealer of hidden realities. His words are not designed to establish institutions. They are meant to ignite transformation in the human soul. One of the sayings preserved in the Gospel declares, "The kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you." When you come to know yourselves, then you will be known and you will realize that you are children of the living Father. Here, salvation is presented not as obedience to external rules, but as a recognition of one's true essence. It is a call to self-knowledge, not in the sense of ego or vanity, but of remembering the divine spark buried beneath layers of illusion. This teaching resonates with the ancient Delphic maxim, "Know thyself," carved into the Temple of Apollo in Greece. It echoes the wisdom of sages across cultures who insisted that the journey inward is the journey to God. Could it be that Jesus was not only a Jewish prophet, but also a universal mystic, one who spoke a language that could bridge traditions and awaken the soul across time and culture? Consider the implications. If knowing yourself is the path to knowing God, then every person carries within them a hidden doorway to the infinite. This vision transforms the human being from a passive recipient of grace into an active seeker of truth. It dismantles the walls between sacred and profane, between priest and layman, between heaven and earth. It makes spirituality a living, breathing reality available to anyone, anywhere. But this vision did not come without conflict. The Gospel of Thomas not only challenges institutional religion, it also challenges the very way we think about Jesus himself. In these sayings, Jesus is not portrayed as a sacrifice to appease divine wrath, nor as a figure whose power lies primarily in miraculous deeds. Instead, he appears as a revealer of wisdom, a teacher of gnosis, a living embodiment of light. Listen to this saying, "There is light within a person of light, and it shines on the whole world. If it does not shine, it is dark." This statement is astonishing in its simplicity. It implies that enlightenment is not limited to Jesus alone. It suggests that every human being has the potential to awaken and become a bearer of light. The question is not whether you believe in Jesus, but whether you allow your own light to shine. Is it any wonder, then, that such a message was deemed dangerous? If ordinary men and women could discover the divine within themselves, What need would they have for elaborate structures of mediation? What need would they have for rigid hierarchies of authority? The Church, built on the foundation of control, could not risk such a message spreading freely. And yet, despite centuries of suppression, here we are, still reading these words, still feeling their power. Across the ages, truth has a way of breaking through, of resurfacing when the time is right. Perhaps this is why the manuscripts at Nag Hammadi were hidden, sealed in jars, buried in desert sand. Perhaps those who preserved them knew that one day the world would be ready to hear again what had once been silenced. Let us reflect for a moment on how different Christianity might look if the Gospel of Thomas had been included in the canon. Would believers today see Jesus less as a figure of distant worship and more as a guide of direct experience? Would churches be less focused on rituals and more on inner transformation? Would spirituality be less about waiting for heaven after death and more about realizing heaven in the present moment? Some scholars suggest that this gospel, far from being a fringe heretical text, might represent the earliest layer of Jesus' teaching, short, sharp sayings designed to shock listeners into awakening. If that is true, then the Jesus of Thomas may be closer to the historical Jesus than the elaborate theological constructions that came later. This possibility is both thrilling and unsettling, for it suggests that much of what we assume about Christianity is a later development, shaped by power struggles, councils, and political agendas, rather than by the words of the teacher himself. What does this mean for you, the seeker watching this now? It means that the words you are hearing might not only be ancient history, but living fire. They challenge you to ask, where is the kingdom in my life? Do I seek it only in sacred buildings, in rituals, or in the approval of others? Or can I begin to see it here in my breath, in the silence of my heart, in the light that flickers within me even now? The power of the Gospel of Thomas is not merely intellectual, it is experiential. It invites you not only to think differently about Jesus, but to live differently yourself. It asks you to see the world with new eyes, to discover the sacred in the ordinary, to remember that the kingdom is spread across the earth, though many do not see it. This is the hidden revolution of the banned gospel. It does not create new dogmas, it dissolves them. It does not bind you with rules, it liberates you with vision. It does not hand you salvation as a transaction, it awakens you to salvation as a state of being. And yet, the most radical message of this gospel still awaits us. For beyond the sayings about light, knowledge, and self-realization lies a final revelation, a teaching so powerful, so transformative, that it may be the very reason this text was feared most of all. In the final part of this journey, we will uncover that ultimate message. We will see why it was buried, why it continues to challenge authority, and why once you hear it, you may never look at Jesus or at yourself the same way again. There comes a point in every exploration of hidden wisdom where the seeker must confront the ultimate question. What is the final truth that these forbidden writings point toward? We have seen how the Gospel of Thomas presents a Jesus who is less a distant figure of worship and more a guide to self-realization. We have seen how his words emphasize knowledge of the self, light within, and the immediacy of the kingdom. But now we arrive at the most challenging and transformative message of all. In one of its most provocative sayings, the Gospel declares, "When you make the two one, and when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the above like the below, and when you make the male and the female into a single one, then you will enter the kingdom." At first glance, this may seem cryptic, even nonsensical. Yet when we pause and contemplate, the depth reveals itself. Here, Jesus is pointing to unity beyond all division. He is teaching that enlightenment, the true experience of the kingdom, comes when we transcend the illusions of separation between spirit and matter, heaven and earth, male and female, self and other. The great secret is that the kingdom is found in oneness, not in duality. This is the most radical teaching of all. It dissolves the boundaries that institutions depend upon, boundaries between clergy and layperson, believer and unbeliever, sacred and profane. It calls us to awaken to a reality where everything is interconnected, where the divine is not somewhere else but here, where opposites are reconciled in the wholeness of being. Consider how powerful this message is. It echoes the Hermetic principle of as above, so below, taught in mystical traditions long before and long after Jesus. It resonates with the Eastern vision of non-duality, where enlightenment is the realization that all forms are expressions of one reality, and it mirrors the insights of modern physics, which tells us that separation is an illusion, that at the deepest level all matter and energy are interconnected fields. If Jesus truly taught this vision of unity, then he was not only a prophet of his time, but a revealer of universal truth, one whose words belong not just to Christianity, but to the entire human story. This would explain why the Church of Power feared the gospel so deeply. A message that transcends boundaries cannot be controlled. A truth that lives in every heart cannot be monopolized. Ask yourself honestly, what would change in your life if you truly believed this? If you knew beyond doubt that the kingdom is not elsewhere, not in a future heaven, not reserved for the few, but here, now in the very fabric of existence, how would you live if you saw the divine in every face, in every moment, in every breath? This is not a distant theology. It is an invitation to transformation. It is a call to see yourself as more than a follower of religion, more than a seeker of external approval. It is a call to remember that you are, in your essence, a child of the living Father, carrying within you the same light that shone through Jesus himself. Throughout history, mystics have risked their lives to remind us of this truth. Meister Eckhart, the medieval Christian mystic, taught that the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. Rumi, the Sufi poet, urged us to stop acting so small. You are the universe in ecstatic motion. These voices echo the same hidden gospel, that the kingdom is within, that we are not separate from the divine, but expressions of it. So why was this gospel banned? Because such a truth undermines every system of external control. A church built on hierarchy cannot allow a gospel that teaches radical equality of the soul. A religion built on waiting for salvation cannot tolerate a gospel that insists salvation is already here. A structure built on fear cannot survive a gospel that proclaims freedom. And yet, the words endure. They have outlived councils, empires, and condemnations. They whisper still, calling to those with ears to hear. They ask us not to discard tradition, but to go deeper than tradition. They ask us not to abandon faith, but to awaken faith into direct experience. Perhaps that is why this gospel was not lost forever. Perhaps that is why it resurfaced in our time, in an age when humanity is once again searching for meaning beyond institutions, beyond rigid dogma, beyond divisions. Perhaps we are ready now, more than ever, to hear the forbidden message and to let it transform us. The question is, what will you do with it? Will you dismiss it as heresy, as the bishops of old once did? Will you file it away as a curiosity of history? Or will you allow its fire to burn in your heart, to awaken you to the truth that the kingdom is here, the light is within you and you are not separate from God? The Gospel of Thomas ends not with a conclusion, but with a challenge, and so too must we end this journey, not with finality, but with an opening. For the last and greatest revelation is this: the kingdom is not something you wait for, it is something you realize. The power is not held by institutions, it is within you. The Christ is not outside of you. He is the light shining through you when you awaken to who you truly are. This is the truth that was banned, this is the truth that was hidden, and this is the truth that once known cannot be forgotten. So now I ask you, are you ready to see yourself not as a seeker of the kingdom, but as its very expression? Are you ready to awaken? If this message has stirred something within you, then let it not fade. Share it, reflect on it, and carry it with you into the silence of your own soul. For in that silence, the forbidden gospel comes alive, not as history, but as living truth. And that truth, once known, can change everything. Thanks for looking.